Gemma McCluskie was a rising television star with a radiant future, and Tony McCluskie was her quiet, troubled brother. No one could have imagined that one would end up dead and the other on trial for murder, tearing apart a family built on trust and turning a sibling bond into a national tragedy. Gemma McCluskie was a familiar face to many in East London. Once a rising star on a well-known British soap opera, she had earned early fame with her talent, charisma, and magnetic screen presence. But despite her promising television career, Gemma chose a quieter life away from the spotlight. She returned to her hometown and moved in with her older brother, hoping to reconnect with her roots, spend more time with family, and plan her next steps. Friends described her as cheerful, ambitious, and grounded. She wasn't just a pretty face on the screen, she was thoughtful, kind, and deeply committed to her loved ones. That's why, when she failed to appear at a charity event she had helped organize, alarm bells began to ring almost immediately. It wasn't like Gemma to disappear without a word. She was known for keeping in touch with her close circle, and her absence from the fundraiser was deeply out of character. When hours turned into a full day, her family reported her missing. At first, authorities considered the possibility that she might have left voluntarily. Celebrities often needed a break from the world. But this theory didn't sit right with those who knew her. Her phone was off, her social media accounts were untouched, and her personal belongings, including her handbag and keys, were still at home. She hadn't taken anything with her. It looked less like a planned disappearance and more like someone who had been suddenly and violently interrupted. The days passed, search efforts intensified. Volunteers combed through parks, alleyways, and canals. Posters with Gemma's face were taped to shop windows, bus stops, and fences. News stations picked up the story, drawing national attention. Missing soap star vanishes without a trace, one headline read. But despite the growing attention, there were no solid leads. CCTV footage didn't show her leaving the area. Neighbors hadn't heard or seen anything unusual. The entire situation was cloaked in silence, a kind of eerie void that left investigators uneasy. Detectives visited Gemma's home multiple times. They interviewed her brother, Tony, who claimed he had last seen her the night before the event. He said they had a minor argument, nothing serious, and then she went to her room. By morning, she was gone. Police noted that the flat was unusually clean, almost too clean. There was no sign of forced entry, no obvious evidence of struggle. Still, something about the situation felt unnatural. Behind the scenes, officers started looking into Gemma's recent activity, calls, messages, online searches, but they found nothing that hinted at plans to leave. Everything suggested she was looking forward to the event, to seeing friends and continuing her career. The days dragged on with no word, no sightings, no clues. Then, a week later, a chilling discovery would turn this from a missing persons case into something far more horrifying. But for now, the mystery of Gemma's vanishing hung heavily over East London, casting a long, cold shadow that only grew darker with each passing hour. A week after Gemma's disappearance, the atmosphere in East London shifted from anxious hope to grim dread. The search efforts had continued non-stop, but despite extensive ground sweeps, interviews, and media appeals, nothing substantial had surfaced. Then, on a grey March afternoon, a passerby walking near Regent's Canal noticed something disturbing floating in the water. It was a large plastic bag, partially submerged, caught between debris and reeds. The smell was strong. When the authorities were called in and the bag was retrieved, what they found inside stunned even the most seasoned investigators. Inside was a human torso, no head, no arms, no legs. The condition of the remains made immediate identification impossible, but suspicions grew quickly. The location was close to where Gemma's phone had last pinged. The wrapping, thick and industrial, looked like something taken from a household supply, the kind that might be found under someone's kitchen sink. Police cordoned off the area, divers were called in, and a methodical search of the canal began. Over the next few days, more bags were discovered. Each contained more body parts, limbs, carefully severed and wrapped, scattered along different sections of the waterway. As if the killer had wanted to make them harder to find, the forensic team worked quickly to preserve what evidence they could. DNA testing confirmed what many feared. The remains belonged to Gemma McCluskie. The news broke like a thunderclap. The missing persons case had become a murder investigation. The public, already emotionally invested, now grieved a young woman who had been taken in the most violent and heartless way imaginable. The story was no longer about a vanished actress. It was now about a calculated killer who had gone to great lengths to hide the crime. Investigators turned their focus inward, toward Gemma's personal life, especially her home. The idea that a stranger had kidnapped her from the street seemed unlikely now. Whoever had killed her knew her, had access to her, and had enough time to dismember and dispose of her body without drawing attention. That pointed to someone close. Someone trusted. Inside her shared apartment, investigators began another round of forensic analysis. Previously overlooked spots were re-examined. Hidden traces of blood, small but telling, were found in the bathroom and around the kitchen sink. A few cleaning supplies were missing from their usual spots. Trash had been taken out unusually early the day after she went missing. None of it was conclusive on its own, but together, the pieces began forming a troubling picture. At the same time, detectives reanalyzed the statements given by Gemma's brother. They pulled CCTV footage from nearby streets and noticed something curious. On the night Gemma vanished, Tony was caught on camera wheeling a large suitcase toward the canal. He returned empty-handed less than an hour later. The timestamp aligned too perfectly with the time window they believed the murder took place. With this new information, investigators began shifting their focus. The horror had not come from outside Gemma's door. It had come from within. As investigators turned their attention to Gemma's home life, the evidence began stacking up in quiet but alarming ways. The flat she shared with her brother Tony had become the central focus of the case. At first glance, Tony had appeared cooperative, emotional even, doing interviews and helping distribute missing person flyers. But with the discovery of Gemma's remains and the CCTV footage of him wheeling a heavy suitcase late at night toward the canal, his role in the investigation shifted dramatically. The suitcase had never been found, but its timing and size matched. What could have been used to transport human remains? What once looked like a grieving brother now raised serious questions. Detectives returned to the flat with a new sense of urgency. The second forensic sweep was more invasive, more precise. In the bathroom, luminol revealed faint splashes of blood beneath layers of bleach. Sections of the flooring showed recent repairs, tiles replaced, caulking still fresh. The sink drain had been scrubbed clean, but residue samples hinted at biological traces. In the kitchen, the cutlery set appeared incomplete. One of the larger knives was missing, and Tony couldn't explain where it had gone. Electronic records added more weight to suspicions. Tony's internet search history was quietly alarming. Phrases like "how to dispose of a body," "bleach to remove DNA," and "dismemberment process" had been entered days before Gemma's body was discovered. He had even searched for canal depths in East London and the schedules for garbage pickup in the area. On their own, these could have been dismissed as odd curiosities. Together, they painted a chilling narrative of premeditation and panic. Despite the growing mountain of circumstantial evidence, Tony insisted on his innocence. He told investigators that he and Gemma had fought that night but claimed she left the house afterward and never returned. However, the door's lock records showed no exit from the apartment during the hours in question. Neighbors hadn't seen Gemma at all after that evening, and there were no camera sightings of her beyond the front steps. Everything pointed to her never making it past the front door. The pressure on Tony intensified. He was called in for formal questioning. Detectives noted his change in demeanor, less composed, more irritable. He stumbled over the timeline, contradicting himself multiple times. When presented with the CCTV footage of the suitcase, he hesitated before claiming it contained old clothes he was discarding. But no clothes were found at the canal. And none of his other actions that night aligned with such a simple explanation. While Tony remained out on bail, police quietly built their case. Witnesses were re-interviewed, footage from neighboring streets was reviewed frame by frame, and forensic experts reconstructed the likely events of that night. Bit by bit, the story came into focus. A fight, an outburst, a death, then a rushed but calculated effort to cover it all up. It wasn't the work of a stranger. It was the work of someone who had once shared family meals and childhood memories with the victim. Someone who had shared her home. As the investigation reached its breaking point, the pressure on Tony McCluskie became impossible to ignore. The evidence now formed a near-complete timeline of events, and the public was watching closely. Under mounting scrutiny and knowing the net was closing in, Tony finally confessed. But his version of the truth raised more questions than it answered. According to Tony, the fatal night began with a petty argument. He claimed Gemma had been nagging him about his laziness, his drinking, and his failure to find work. The disagreement turned heated. He described snapping, pushing her during a moment of anger. She fell, hit her head, and lay still. In panic, he said, he believed she was dead. What happened next, he insisted, was not murder, it was fear, shock, and a catastrophic overreaction, but investigators weren't convinced. The post-mortem results painted a different picture. Gemma hadn't simply fallen. She had been struck multiple times in the head with a blunt object, likely the missing kitchen knife or another heavy household item. Defensive wounds on her arms and hands suggested she had fought back, trying desperately to protect herself. The smothering Tony described wasn't reflected in the medical findings. What was clear was that the attack had been sustained and violent. This wasn't the result of a single push. It was a deliberate assault. Tony's story continued with a disturbing level of detail. After realizing what he had done, he said, he spent hours pacing the flat. In those early moments of panic, he considered calling the police or an ambulance, but ultimately chose silence. Instead of help, he reached for cleaning supplies. He began scrubbing blood from the bathroom tiles. He dismembered Gemma's body in the bathtub, carefully cutting and wrapping each part in plastic bags. Then, over the course of 2 days, he walked them in a suitcase to the canal and dropped them into the water, hoping the current would carry them far from where she was last seen. Forensics later confirmed that the drain in the flat had been used to dispose of biological material. Traces of Gemma's blood were found under the newly replaced flooring. Even the washing machine contained fibers and bloodstains, likely from the towels and clothes used to clean the scene. Tony had taken every step he could to erase what he had done, but the evidence remained. His confession, though disturbing, wasn't a full admission of guilt. He clung to the idea that it had been an accident, that he hadn't meant for things to go so far. But the calculated cover-up told another story. The digital searches, the bleach, the dismemberment, they all pointed to a man who had not just lost control, but one who had taken methodical steps to conceal a brutal crime. The prosecution began assembling a watertight case. Motive, method, and aftermath were all clearly outlined. It was no longer a question of whether Tony was guilty. It was about making sure the court saw the full picture of what had happened behind closed doors. The courtroom was filled with a heavy silence as the trial of Tony McCluskie began. Reporters filled the gallery, and members of the public waited anxiously for justice to unfold. Gemma's friends and family sat in quiet rows, clutching tissues, photographs, and one another. Their grief was visible, but so was their strength. They wanted the truth exposed, not just for closure, but to make sure her life and her death meant something. The prosecution wasted no time. From the first day, they laid out a carefully constructed timeline built on forensic evidence, CCTV footage, internet search histories, and Tony's own confession. Every detail was methodically presented, each piece adding to the chilling mosaic of a crime committed not in the heat of passion, but with troubling clarity and intent. The court heard how Tony had been living in the flat rent-free, unemployed, and often intoxicated. Tensions between the siblings had been rising for months. Gemma had grown frustrated with his behavior and lack of direction. Witnesses described how she had confided in them, worried about her safety and eager to move out. But she stayed, perhaps out of loyalty or hope that things would improve. In the end, that choice cost her life. The prosecution argued that the murder had not been spontaneous. The evidence of online searches, the organized cleanup, and the dismemberment pointed to premeditation, even if it was only in the hours following the crime. Tony's defense struggled to maintain their version of events. They claimed he was under emotional distress, that the killing was not planned, and that his actions afterward were the panicked decisions of a man overwhelmed by guilt. But the jury was unconvinced. His steps were too methodical. His behavior, after the crime, shopping for bleach, scrubbing floors, transporting her remains in a suitcase, showed clear intent to hide what he had done. There were no signs he had ever planned to confess until it became unavoidable. His tears in court did little to soften the impact of the facts. After several days of testimony and deliberation, the jury reached a unanimous verdict. Tony McCluskie was found guilty of the murder of his sister Gemma and was sentenced to life in prison. The courtroom remained still as the sentence was read. There was no celebration, only quiet, exhausted acceptance. Justice had been served, but the pain remained. In the weeks that followed, Gemma's family worked to shift the narrative from her brutal death to her life and legacy. A foundation was created in her name to support victims of domestic abuse and family violence. Campaigns were launched to raise awareness about hidden dangers that often go unnoticed within households. Gemma's story became a symbol, a reminder that even the safest places can turn deadly when anger and resentment are left unchecked. Though the tragedy of her loss would never fade, those who loved her vowed to ensure her memory would outshine the darkness that had taken her. In the end, Gemma McCluskie's story became more than a crime, it became a catalyst for change.